Your guardian angel is not here to protect you from pain. It is here to make sure you feel every single drop of it. That sentence probably landed somewhere uncomfortable, and it was meant to, because for decades, maybe centuries, we have been handed a specific story about the divine beings assigned to our lives, soft-winged presences that whisper comfort, redirect traffic lights in our favor, and shield us from the worst of what the world can do. We light candles for them. We thank them when the parking spot opens up. We picture them standing behind us at our most vulnerable moments, arms outstretched, keeping the darkness at bay. But what if that image is not just incomplete? What if it is the precise inversion of the truth? There is a pattern that mystics across completely unconnected traditions have described for thousands of years in the writings of Saint John of the Cross, in the Sufi poetry of Rumi, in the Tibetan teachings on Bardo, in the alchemical texts of Renaissance Europe. They all describe a moment or a prolonged season of moments when the soul is not held gently but shattered deliberately, when everything that gave you identity, comfort, and direction collapses at once, when the divine presence in your life is not a hand catching you as you fall, but the force that removed the flaw in the first place. They called it the dark night of the soul, and they did not describe it as a tragedy. They described it as a method. What we are going to explore together is not a comfortable idea. It is the possibility that your greatest losses, your most disorienting collapses, the moments when you felt most abandoned by the universe were not accidents. They were architecture, designed, managed, and delivered by the very guardian you thought had gone silent. So the real question is not whether your guardian angel exists. The real question is whether you have fundamentally misunderstood its job description. There is a version of spiritual belief that has become enormously popular in recent decades, and it is, at its core, a theology of comfort. It tells you that the universe is conspiring in your favor, that your angels are rearranging circumstances to smooth your path, that if you raise your vibration high enough, difficulty will simply stop arriving at your door. It is warm, it is reassuring, and it has sold an extraordinary number of books. But here is what the oldest traditions in the world actually say. If you read them without the modern filter of self-help optimism, the divine does not prioritize your comfort. It prioritizes your completion. Think of it this way. A master sculptor does not approach a block of marble with a velvet cloth and gentle encouragement. The sculptor arrives with a chisel and a hammer. The violence of the strike is not cruelty, it is precision. Every blow is aimed at removing exactly what does not belong to the final form that was always hidden inside the stone. Michelangelo is said to have described his process as simply revealing what was already there, liberating the figure imprisoned within the raw material. Your guardian angel, in this older and far less comfortable understanding, is not a protector of the marble, it is the sculptor. The New Age movement, particularly in its post-2000 expression, took the genuine spiritual insight that we are loved and supported by forces beyond our perception and translated it into something closer to a cosmic customer service department. Call on your angels and relief will come. Sit in meditation and the obstacles will dissolve. But this translation, however well-intentioned, strips out the most radical and transformative element of genuine mystical teaching, that love, at the level of the divine, sometimes looks nothing like what we recognize as kindness. The Sufi masters described Allah as both Al-Latif, the subtle and gentle, and Al-Qahar, the subduer, the overwhelming force. Both names, they insisted, described the same reality. The Vedic tradition speaks of Shiva not as an evil counterpart to the gentler deities, but as the great destroyer whose destruction is itself an act of grace, because what Shiva destroys is always the illusion that was imprisoning you. Even within Christianity, the mystic Meister Eckhart wrote that God's love is so total, so uncompromising, that it will burn away everything in you that is not truly you. That burning is not punishment, it is the fire of transformation. What all of these traditions are pointing toward is a specific and unsettling possibility, that there exists a form of divine intervention that does not look like intervention at all. It looks like abandonment, it looks like collapse, it looks like every structure you trusted deciding to fail simultaneously, leaving you standing in the rubble of your own life, wondering what you did to deserve it. And the answer those traditions would give you is quietly radical. You did not do anything to deserve it. You earned it. There is a version of you that your guardian has been holding in its awareness since before your first breath. a version forged not in ease, but in fire, and the dark night is how that version gets summoned. So what does that actually look like in a human life? What are the specific mechanics of a divinely engineered collapse? And how do you know when everything is falling apart, whether you are experiencing bad luck or a targeted intervention? That is exactly where we are going next. The first sign, the myth of the passive protector. Before we can understand what the dark night actually is, we have to dismantle what we think a guardian angel is supposed to do. And that means confronting a story that has been so thoroughly absorbed into modern spiritual culture that it feels like ancient wisdom, even though it is largely a product of the last 50 years. The passive protector narrative goes something like this. You have a celestial being assigned to you, present since your birth, whose primary function is to intervene when danger approaches, soften the blows that would otherwise break you, and send you signs of encouragement when you feel lost. In this model, the guardian angel is essentially a divine safety net, always below you, always ready to catch you, ensuring that while life may be difficult, it never becomes truly destructive. This is a deeply human wish. Of course it is. The desire for a protector who will not let the worst happen is as old as consciousness itself. And there are genuine moments of what can only be called grace, near accidents that did not happen, unexpected help that arrived at the exact right moment, a voice in the mind that said, "Don't go that way," and turned out to be correct. That seemed to support this model. But here is what this comfortable version of angelic intervention quietly ignores. The mystics who wrote most extensively about guardian presences and divine guidance did not describe beings primarily concerned with your physical safety or emotional ease. They described fierce intelligences whose loyalty was not to the version of you that existed now, but to the version of you that was possible. And those two loyalties are not always compatible. The Zoroastrian tradition speaks of the Fravashi, the divine twin or higher soul that exists in a perfect state beyond the physical realm. The Fravashi does not descend to make your earthly life comfortable. It pulls the earthly self upward, toward its own completion, regardless of how disorienting that ascent feels. The ancient Greeks described the daimon, the inner guiding spirit, not as a comfort bringer, but as a relentless inner compass oriented toward your deepest nature. Socrates famously trusted his daimon above his own reasoning, above social convention, above even his survival instinct. The daimon was not gentle, it was true. What changes when you replace the passive protector model with the fierce guardian model is everything. Suddenly, the silences that felt like abandonment become deliberate. The removed safety nets become calculated. The timing of certain collapses, why this job, why this relationship, why now, begins to carry the unmistakable texture of intention. You were not left alone. You were left alone on purpose. And that shift in perception from victim of circumstance to subject of a high-stakes spiritual intervention is not just philosophically interesting. It is the first crack in the old self that makes everything else possible. The second sign, the engineered collapse. There is a pattern that appears with striking consistency in the lives of people who later describe profound spiritual transformation. It is not a single loss or a single failure. It is a simultaneous collapse across multiple domains: career, relationships, health, identity, meaning, happening within the same compressed window of time, as if coordinated. Psychologists who study post-traumatic growth have noticed this clustering effect. Philosophers call it a limit situation, a moment when ordinary coping mechanisms simply stop working, when the scaffolding of your constructed life reveals itself as scaffolding, and the wall it was holding up comes down with it. But the mystics gave it a far more specific and alarming name. They called it the divine wrecking ball. Imagine you have spent years building a structure. You placed each brick carefully. The career that gave you status, the relationship that gave you identity, the beliefs that gave you a framework for making sense of the world, the daily routines that gave you the illusion of control. From the outside, it looks solid. From the inside, it feels like home. And then, in a period that might span 6 months or 3 years, every load-bearing wall begins to crack simultaneously. The job ends or becomes unbearable. The relationship fractures in ways that cannot be repaired. The belief system that once felt like granite reveals itself as sand. The body begins sending signals that cannot be ignored. And in the middle of all of it, the prayers go unanswered, the signs stop coming, and the presence that you once felt nearby goes completely silent. This is not bad luck, or rather, it is not only bad luck. What the mystical traditions consistently describe is that a guardian who is truly committed to your evolution will, at a critical juncture, systematically dismantle the structures that are keeping you comfortable in a life that is too small for you. The Sufi concept of fana, which translates roughly as annihilation, is not a metaphor. It describes the actual experience of the ego self being stripped of its familiar supports, not all at once in a single dramatic moment, but layer by layer, domain by domain, until what remains is the raw, undefended, terrified, and somehow still alive core of who you actually are. Why would a guardian do this? Because stagnation, in the metaphysics of almost every serious tradition, is the only true spiritual danger. A life of managed comfort in which the soul never reaches its actual potential is considered in this framework a far worse outcome than a life of agonizing upheaval that ends in genuine transformation. Your guardian is not weighing your happiness against your pain. It is weighing your temporary comfort against your eternal completion. The shift in perspective that this invites is one of the most difficult and most liberating movements available to a human being. To look at the rubble of what you built and entertain, even tentatively the possibility that this was not done to you, but for you, that the wrecking ball had a blueprint, is to step out of victimhood and into something that has no comfortable name, not acceptance exactly, not surrender in the passive sense, something closer to a terrified and grudging collaboration with a process that is larger than your current understanding. Have you ever looked back at something you lost, a job, a relationship, a version of yourself, and felt years later that losing it was the best thing that ever happened to you? That feeling is the retrospective recognition of the engineered collapse. The question is whether you can begin to recognize it while it is still happening. The third sign, the anatomy of a managed dark night. Saint John of the Cross was a 16th century Spanish mystic, a Carmelite friar, who was imprisoned by members of his own religious order in a cell barely large enough to turn around in. He had no light, he had almost no food, he was flogged regularly, and in that cell, he wrote some of the most luminous poetry in the Spanish language, describing what he called La noche oscura del alma, the dark night of the soul, as a precise, almost clinical process of spiritual transformation. What is extraordinary about his description is how undramatic it is in a certain sense. He does not describe the dark night as a supernatural visitation or a mystical experience in the conventional sense. He describes it as an absence, the absence of consolation, of felt connection to the divine, of the emotional rewards that had previously accompanied prayer and devotion. God, in his description, does not arrive with fire and revelation. God withdraws, and that withdrawal is the instrument. This is the mechanism that most modern spiritual frameworks fail to account for. We expect divine intervention to feel like intervention, like something arriving. The managed dark night works in the opposite direction. It works through removal. The comfort is taken away, the clarity is taken away, the sense of being held is taken away. And what remains in that hollow space is finally you, stripped of every external support, every emotional crutch, every identity layer that depended on feeling spiritually nourished and cosmically approved. The guardian who engineers this process, according to these traditions, is not absent during the dark night. It is more present than ever, but its presence has shifted from supportive to pressurized. It is using the biological and psychological systems of the human being, the nervous system's response to prolonged uncertainty, the psyche's desperate search for meaning in conditions of meaninglessness, the body's somatic response to grief and disorientation as a kind of pressure cooker. The heat is intentional. The sealed lid is intentional. What is being cooked is the old self. There is a specific phase within the dark night that multiple traditions identify and which modern depth psychologists have independently documented in their clinical work. It is the threshold of despair, the moment when the ego has exhausted every strategy for maintaining its structure and faces what feels like annihilation. This is the moment that is most commonly misread as breakdown. It is, in the language of the traditions, the moment just before breakthrough. The guardian chooses isolation during this phase because isolation is the only condition in which the inner voice becomes louder than the external noise. Every human being carries, beneath the layers of social persona and conditioned response, an authentic signal, a knowing that is not learned but remembered. That signal is almost impossible to hear in ordinary life, because ordinary life is extraordinarily loud. The dark night quiets everything else, sometimes through circumstances that feel brutal, specifically so that signal can finally be heard. The fourth sign, the mechanics of agonizing evolution. Pain, in the framework we are exploring, is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a diagnostic instrument. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive and most important reframe available in this entire conversation, and it deserves to be held carefully. When a guardian engineers a dark night, the specific texture of the suffering is not random. The domains that collapse, the fears that surface, the beliefs that are exposed as hollow, these are not arbitrary. They are, in this understanding, precisely targeted at the places where the soul is most resistant to its own evolution. Pain, in this model, is a form of information. It reveals the architecture of your attachment. It shows you with brutal accuracy exactly where you are still clinging to a version of yourself or a version of your life that your higher nature has already outgrown. Think of it this way. Friction in a physical system is greatest at the point where two surfaces resist each other most intensely. In the same way, the most agonizing points in a dark night are not accidental. They mark the precise locations where your lower desires, your conditioned patterns, your ego's survival strategies are in direct conflict with the trajectory of your higher destiny. The pain is the friction of evolution. It is not punishment, it is diagnostic precision. There is also a collective dimension to this that feels increasingly relevant in the present moment. The year 2026 is not an ordinary chapter in human history. Anyone paying attention to the scale and speed of global transformation across political, ecological, technological, and social domains simultaneously can feel that something structural is shifting. And the mystics of multiple traditions have described collective dark nights, periods when the shared structures of human civilization undergo the same engineered collapse that individuals experience privately for the same reasons and toward the same end. The dissolution of what has become too small, too rigid, too resistant to what humanity is actually capable of becoming. Your personal dark night, in this sense, is not isolated from the collective one. The friction you feel in your individual life is resonant with the friction of a species navigating its own threshold of despair. You are not just being evolved, you are participating through your own transformation in something much larger than yourself. The Hermetic tradition, particularly in its alchemical expression, described this process as the nigredo, the blackening, the phase in which the base material is dissolved completely before it can be transmuted into gold. The alchemists were not, despite popular misconception, primarily interested in transforming physical metals. They were mapping the interior journey of the human soul, using the language of chemistry as a code. The nigredo is not a phase to be skipped or shortened. It is the phase in which everything that was mixed, impure, and inauthentic is finally separated out, leaving only what is real. And what the Guardian knows, even when you do not, is that you are not your fear. You are not your grief. You are not the identity that the collapse is dismantling. Those were always the scaffolding, not the structure. What is being revealed in the blackening is the only thing that cannot be taken away. The fifth sign, integrating the sovereign self. There is a moment. It rarely announces itself dramatically, but when it comes, those who have passed through it describe it with extraordinary consistency. When the quality of the darkness changes, it does not end, but it shifts. Something that felt like pressure begins to feel like direction. Something that felt like loss begins to feel like clearing. And the first fragile, tentative outlines of a new structure begin to emerge, not from effort or planning, but from the deeper intelligence that the dark night was always trying to access. This is the transition from surviving the destruction to becoming the architect of your new reality. And it is a transition that cannot be forced, only recognized when it arrives. The Guardian's methods do not change in this phase, but your relationship to them does. The synchronicities that seemed taunting during the dark night begin to feel like coordinates. The silence that felt like abandonment begins to feel like space, deliberate, generous space in which something new can take form without being crowded out by the noise of who you used to be. The Jungian concept of individuation is useful here. Jung spent decades documenting the psychological process by which a human being moves from living according to the expectations and projections of the collective, the family, the culture, the social role, toward living from the deepest and most authentic center of their own being. He called this the self, with a capital S, distinguishing it from the ego self that is constructed in childhood and reinforced by social approval. The dark night, in Jungian terms, is the ego's encounter with the self, and the ego, which has been running the show up until that point, does not give up its authority without a fight. What integration looks like, practically, is a reorientation of your inner compass. The question shifts. You stop asking, "How do I get back to what I had?" and begin asking, "What is this experience pointing me toward?" You stop trying to rebuild the structure that collapsed and begin to sense, however faintly, the outline of a structure you have never inhabited before, one that is somehow more native to you, more congruent with what you actually are, than anything you built from ambition or fear or the need for approval. The Guardian's harsh methods are not something you learn to love exactly. You learn to work with them, the way a skilled sailor learns to work with a difficult wind, not by wishing the wind were gentler, but by understanding its logic, adjusting your sails, and using the force that cannot be controlled to carry you somewhere the still water never could. Rumi, in his most famous poem, begins with the image of the reed flute crying for its origin, that famous longing for the reed bed from which it was cut. What is often missed in casual readings of this poem is that the separation is not presented as a mistake or a tragedy. The cut is what made music possible. The reed that was never separated from the reed bed was never hollow enough for the breath of the divine to pass through it and become song. The dark night is the cut. The Guardian holds the knife, and the music that emerges on the other side is the only thing that was ever really yours. The Guardian was never separate from you. Here is where everything we have explored tilts on its axis and reveals a deeper geometry beneath itself. Throughout this entire conversation, we have been speaking of the guardian angel as something external, a separate intelligence, a distinct being, an other that operates upon you from a position outside your own consciousness. And that framework is useful. It is the framework that makes the engineered collapse comprehensible, that transforms victimhood into participation, that gives the dark night a logic it would otherwise lack. But now we need to press one layer deeper, because the most radical teaching hidden inside every tradition we have touched is not that your guardian is fierce instead of gentle. It is that the boundary between the guardian and the guarded is far more permeable than it appears. The Vedantic tradition, at its most uncompromising, describes what it calls the Antaryamin, the inner controller, the divine intelligence that dwells not beside you, but within the deepest stratum of your own being, animating your very consciousness, knowing your every thought not because it watches from outside but because it is, in some sense that defies ordinary language, what you most essentially are. The Hermetic tradition makes the same gesture from a different angle. The kingdom of heaven is within you, a teaching so familiar that its radicalism has been almost entirely domesticated. Not near you, not above you, within. What this suggests about the dark night is something that stops the mind completely when you sit with it long enough. If the guardian that engineers your collapse is not fully external to you, if it is in some sense the deepest and most evolved dimension of your own being, reaching backward through the layers of your conditioned self to dismantle what no longer serves, then the dark night is not something being done to you by another. It is something being done to part of you by a deeper part of you. Your higher self, in this understanding, is not a superior being watching your life from a celestial balcony and occasionally intervening. It is the most awake version of you, operating from a vantage point that your ordinary consciousness cannot access, using the full force of its clarity and love. A love that does not flinch from causing temporary suffering, when temporary suffering is the only instrument capable of producing permanent liberation, to break open the shell of who you thought you were, so that who you actually are can finally breathe. This is the vertiginous realization at the center of it all. The hand that removed the flaw was your own. The voice that went silent during your darkest season was silent because it had moved closer, not farther, moved from the periphery of your awareness to the very core of it, where it had always been, waiting for the noise to stop so that the recognition could happen. You were never abandoned. You were being remembered by yourself. What this demands of you now. If any part of what we have explored tonight lands as true even tentatively, even as a possibility worth holding, then it carries implications that are not comfortable to live with. And that discomfort is itself part of the point. The first implication is responsibility. Not the punishing, shame-based variety that the conditioned self knows so well, but a deeper and far more demanding kind. the responsibility of someone who begins to understand that their suffering has direction. If your pain is diagnostic, if the specific textures of your collapse are revealing the exact contours of your resistance, then the pain is also information you are now obligated to read. You cannot unknow this. You cannot return to the position of pure victim once you have genuinely entertained the possibility that the universe is not random in its cruelty, but precise in its love. The second implication is attention. The Guardian communicates during the dark night, not through dramatic revelation, but through the quietest possible signals, the persistent image that appears in dreams, the book that falls open to the exact right page, the stranger who says something that unlocks a door in your chest you did not know was closed. These signals were always there, but the ordinary mind, busy defending its existing structure, could not afford to notice them. The collapse strips away that busyness. The question now is whether you are willing to pay the quality of attention that the moment is asking for. And the third implication is perhaps the most personally demanding. If your Guardian's harsh methods are not mistakes, but instruments, and if the Guardian and your higher self are in some profound sense the same intelligence, then fighting the process is not just painful, it is a form of fighting yourself. Every time you exhaust your energy trying to rebuild what was deliberately dismantled, every time you pour your grief into mourning, the specific form your life used to take, rather than into sensing the form it is trying to become, you are working against the very force that is trying to complete you. This does not mean passivity. It does not mean surrendering your agency or accepting harmful situations under the banner of spiritual growth. The distinction is subtle but crucial. You can take intelligent action in your life while simultaneously releasing your attachment to a specific outcome, trusting that the intelligence operating through your circumstances has a better view of the terrain than your frightened ego does. The sailor does not stop sailing in difficult wind, but the sailor stops insisting the wind blow from a different direction. Are you in a season of collapse right now? Is there a domain of your life, or several, where the floor has recently disappeared? Then consider just for a moment that the silence you may be experiencing from the divine is not absence, it is proximity. The Guardian has moved to the only place from which the real work can be done, inside the rubble, inside the grief, inside the terrifying openness of a life that has not yet found its new form. It is there with you, not despite the darkness, but as the darkness, waiting for the moment when you stop running from what you are becoming and finally turn to face it. The question that has no answer. The Emerald Tablet, that enigmatic alchemical text attributed to Hermes Trismegistus and considered foundational to the entire Western esoteric tradition, contains a line that has been translated and retranslated for centuries without being exhausted. That which is below corresponds to that which is above, and that which is above corresponds to that which is below, to accomplish the miracle of the one thing. As above, so below. As within, so without. The cosmos and the soul are not analogous to each other. They are reflections of each other, mirrors in which the same pattern appears at every scale. The dark night of an individual soul and the dark night of a civilization are not separate events. The Guardian that pushes a single human being through the fire of their own transformation and the intelligence that moves through the upheavals of history are expressions of the same incomprehensible, fierce and utterly committed love. You are not a small thing enduring a large universe. You are the universe enduring itself at the specific scale of a human life, for reasons that may never be fully legible to the part of you that asks why. The mystics did not claim to have answered this. St. John of the Cross, having written the most precise map of the dark night that any human being has ever produced, concluded not with an explanation, but with an image. The soul, having passed through the night, arriving at a dawn so luminous that language fails it entirely. The map ends. The territory begins. So here is the question that does not get answered, the one that the dark night plants in you like a seed and then steps back from, leaving you to discover what it grows into. If the Guardian that has been pushing you toward your highest self is not separate from your highest self, and your highest self is not separate from the ground of all being, from what the Vedas call Brahman, from what the mystics call God, from what the physicists are beginning to call the unified field, then who exactly is suffering the dark night, and who is watching? If these questions find a home somewhere in your thinking, consider staying close to this channel. Mystery Hunter is not a place where we arrive at final answers. It is a place where we learn to ask better questions and to sit with the ones that refuse to be resolved. because those are always the ones pointing towards something real. The hunt continues, and wherever you are in your own dark night, you are not as alone in it as it feels.